This rather evocative image of Abbotsford, of course, is courtesy of Scott, who thought that he would put in this lovely rising damp or vapour to make my Victorian fantasy have something even more dramatic. So we are going to be looking at Victorian castle building and the fixation that they developed in the opening years of the 19th century to indeed build castles. And we're going to come back and talk about Abbotsford in just a minute, but I'm going to set the scene by taking us back to the original Palace of Westminster. When I say the original Palace of Westminster, I mean the one that had accrued over many centuries. You're seeing it here, dating to about 1800. You can see on the left-hand side some very obvious Georgian neoclassical buildings. And then on the right-hand side, what is usually referred to as 18th century Gothic, spelt with a G-O-T-H-I-C-K on the end. And you can see that the Palace of Westminster had developed ad hoc. It was essentially a mishmash of several different architectural styles, and you can see the original Westminster Hall, sometimes known as St Stephen's. Well, there was once a chapel in the centre dedicated to St Stephen's. It's now St Stephen's Hall. But you can see that there's a bit of original Gothic, some neoclassical, and some faux Gothic. So not surprisingly, there were quite a lot of debates about pulling down the Palace of Westminster and putting up something new and far more splendid. So here is the design for a new House of Lords proposed by Sir John Soane. Now, as you can see, this is a splendid affair in the neoclassical style. You can perhaps just make the corner of Westminster Abbey out right in the very corner of the image. And I suppose one would expect Sir John Soane to produce something as magnificent as this in the neoclassical style, as that was very much the image that he wanted to create. Obviously, classicism was imbued with all sorts of political meaning, and by the time we get into the 19th century, it's going to speak very much to our imperial ambitions. But before we could pull down the Palace of Westminster and build a new one, this happened. The terrible fire that occurs in October 1834, when the entire building, apart from one or two fragments, is destroyed. You can just make out the towers of Westminster Abbey behind the conflagration, which is here depicted by Turner, who spent the whole night in and on the water on the Thames, trying to capture the spectacular effect of the Palace of Westminster going up in flames. Now, all of this leads to what becomes known as the Battle of the Styles, as there was a huge debate about what style to rebuild the Palace of Westminster in. We could have gone for the Sir John Soane classical style, but in fact, we opted for something distinctly Gothic. The architect of this, of course, is Sir Charles Barry, and quite interestingly enough, for the Foreign Office, he went back to a neoclassical style, again because the two styles, Gothic on the one hand and classical on the other, were now imbued with political meaning. To build in the classical spoke of longevity, solidity and stability, and clearly in the case of the Foreign Office, also this idea of our colonial ambitions. But opting for the Gothic, but I should really, I think, put a caveat in there, because the Palace of Westminster is really more Elizabethan than anything else. It's very symmetric. It doesn't have the irregular roofline that you associate with medieval buildings. And much of the ornamentation, which is by Pugin, who again we'll come back to in a minute, is more in a Tudor or Elizabethan style than Gothic. Nevertheless, it was felt that this building would harmonise with Westminster Abbey and also speak to British identity, because the Gothic was now embraced not only as the true Northern style, but also as the true Christian style, as opposed to the classicism of Greece and Rome, which was associated with the pagan. So this battle becomes known as the Battle of the Styles, and it's very much rooted in this concept of giving architectural styles an ideology. I'm taking you here to the central lobby, not just to admire the amazing Minton encaustic tiles and the very obvious, fantastic Gothic ornamentation, but to show you this rather wonderful glass mosaic, which is by Walter Crane. As this introduces another reason why the Gothic is going to come back in the 19th century with such a vengeance. St. George for England in the centre, in a rather wonderful suit of armour, is basically embodying our idea of chivalry. And I suppose because we have a lot of social change in the 19th century, chivalry was going to provide a code which set down how a gentleman should behave and also how a lady. The great medieval stories, the Morte d'Arthur, which of course is then transposed into the poem The Idylls or Idylls of the Kings by Tennyson, and an awakening, or in fact a very strong interest throughout the 19th century in Chaucer. All of this again comes together to create a rose-tinted image of medieval values. And there was one particular novelist who did much to instill in us the concepts of chivalry and romance, and that is Sir Walter Scott. This is his baronial Scottish home, Abbotsford. It was built between 1817 and 1825, and our castle building definitely seems to gel with the Napoleonic period and the era immediately after the war. Perhaps some of these castles can be seen as a form of celebration, or just simply this idea of cementing a strong British identity. The architects for this, well, essentially the architect was Sir Walter Scott, but he was aided by William Aitkenson and the builder Edward Blore. It's often said that Scott was the pioneer of this baronial style, which comes to full fruition in the castle built by Prince Albert and Queen Victoria at Balmoral. So what were we reading by Scott? Well, undoubtedly essays on chivalry, romance and drama, but even more so his novels like The Antiquary and Ivanhoe. And the story of Ivanhoe is one again of your typical medieval knight who is going forth and rescuing damsels in distress. That was published in 1820. According to legend, the young William Morris had read all of the so-called Waverley novels by Sir Walter Scott during his childhood. And there was no doubt that he was absolutely bowled over by Ivanhoe. Legend has it he had a pony and a miniature suit of armour so he could ride around his family estate pretending to be a knight in shining armour. That was, by the way, the estate was in Epping Forest. So I'm just taking you to the inside of Abbotsford, again to emphasise how they were quite happy to mix styles together. Whilst the outside of Abbotsford might again exemplify Scottish baronial, the inside looks more Elizabethan. The models would undoubtedly have been places like Hampton Court, particularly for that heavily beamed ceiling. And here we are in the entrance hall, which has a wonderful fireplace, which would never have been found in the medieval period, in the sense that it appears to have been concocted out of Gothic tracery, the type of tracery that we would associate with ecclesiastical buildings. The hall is laden with armour. That's another obsession of the 19th century, collecting it, I mean. So if you've been to visit the Wallace collection, you'll know that Sir Richard Wallace put together one of the most important collections of armour in Europe. It's again conjures up this image of a lost romantic chivalric past. Also, please note all the coats of arms, because there'll be an intense interest in heraldry and tracing your family ideally back to its Norman or even pre-Norman roots. So here we've got another magnificent entrance hall. This is Easton Castle, which is in Herefordshire. you can see that there are sort of synergies with the hall that we've just been looking at Abbotsford. Not so much armour, but obviously an homage to hunting from all the different animal heads rising up the staircase. And as we'll see in a minute, this hallway will take you into a very splendid central, I suppose technically a drawing room, but to be quite honest, it looks more splendid than your average drawing room, as you'll see in just a minute. But first of all, this is what Easter Castle looks like from the exterior. It's by Robert Smirke. He's most famous for being the architect of the British Museum, which is in a very overt classical style. This is built between 1812 and 1820 for the Somers Cox family, who were not exactly new money, but they were considered by some to be arrivistes. So it was quite useful to build a castle in terms of establishing your lineage. You can see it's perfectly symmetric, could not possibly be defensible. It's got a multitude of windows. And again, you can see they start to build it during the Napoleonic War period, which of course ends in 1815. So here's that rather splendid drawing room in the centre. You can see immediately that this isn't really in a Gothic style at all. It's essentially round arch Romanesque. So in this early phase of castle building, there was no problem mixing your styles together. You could range across the entire chronology, Norman, English Gothic, so that's lancet or early pointed, middle, and then the decorated at the end, which is perpendicular. And then you could even, if you wanted to, borrow from the Tudors and the Elizabethans. What I'm trying to put over is there was no need for archaeological accuracy, because this is a romance of the past. However, this is going to be challenged very shortly by Augustus Pugin, who's going to take a overtly architecturally correct archaeological approach to building castles in particular and churches. So here are his birth and death dates. He did not make old bones, 1812 to 52. Some people feel that he literally worked himself to death. He was the architect of the Gothic court held at Crystal Palace in 1851. And it was this that sort of helped to sell the Gothic to the middle classes. So we have a flourishing of suburban Gothic villas after 1851. At Easter Castle, this is the so-called Pugin room, dates to 1849. And you could still argue that it is not particularly correct in terms of its Gothic. That wonderful fan vaulting is likely to be out of plaster and wood as opposed to stone in the original, and has been elaborately gilded, as you can see, and also elaborately painted. But Pugin was an advocate of reintroducing the polychromatic decoration that he believed had was originally to be found in our ecclesiastical buildings. So it's a very elaborate drawing room indeed, with its heavily ornamented ceiling, and even more remarkable is that tree over the fireplace. What I mean by tree is it's a genealogical tree, tracing the Somers Cox family back as far as they could take it. Everybody wanted to be associated with the Norman Conquest or even earlier. Genealogy and heraldry are again all part of this Gothic revival, which really takes off from the middle of the 19th century. So Pugin, of course, here he is, with his coat of arms in the background, is undoubtedly the progenitor of what becomes known as the Gothic revival. You can see him here with a plan, possibly, of the Palace of Westminster, as he was responsible for much of its decoration. He was, as you can tell from his name, ironically, in terms of establishing a British identity through Gothic architecture, French in terms of his birthright. De Pugin should be his full name. And he comes also from an architectural lineage, as his father was an architect before him. What makes Pugin so committed to the Gothic is he converts to Roman Catholicism in 1834. You're seeing here the frontispiece to his influential polemic contrasts, because he's not just interested in the architecture of the Gothic period, he's also going to argue that the Gothic represents the Christian values. It is the moral style in terms of Christian virtue. And in this opening gamut, we see a contrast between a modern city of the 1840s, which all the churches are in ruins or dilapidated. We can see smoking chimneys and warehouses. This is a world ruled by Mammon. And in the immediate foreground, we have the workhouse. The contrast below of the Catholic town of 1440, all those glittering spires. Churches dominates rather than factory chimneys. And this idea was taken further in this contrast between the workhouse and an ecclesiastical establishment, a monastic establishment down the bottom. The workhouse was very destructive. It broke up families, as you can see down the bottom, the father going in one direction, pulled apart from his wife and children. Your body was likely to be sold off for dissection. The food was disgusting. Your warden was a brute. It was only one step removed from being a prison. And down below we have the monastic equivalent, the beautiful chapel, the monastic buildings. Here you'll receive communion, have a decent burial, or receive alms. There'll be somebody looking after you. It might be very paternalistic. You might have to know your place. But the idea was that those who were better off and in a better social position were obligated to look after those who were not. So this was one of the main reasons why Pugin was advocating the concept of Christian values as expressed through Gothic architecture. I couldn't resist putting in the contrast between water in the 19th century and water in the medieval. So here we are in St Anne's, Soho, with a private water pump. The child is being chased away by the peeler as she doesn't have a penny to get a cup of water. And all of this seems quite apt now, given the state of our water. When back in the medieval period, as you can see here, we have in 1749 a rather beautiful Gothic water fountain, which is there to supply water for all. How very democratic. So you can see in all aspects of life, Pugin was arguing for the medieval model. In terms of the style, that is put forward, the stylistic elements of the Gothic that he preferred in his True Principles of Pointed or Christian Architecture, published in 1841. It includes this page, which highlights his own mistakes. This very elaborate furniture is sometimes referred to as Strawberry Hill Gothic, a reference to Horace Walpole's famous mid-18th century house, which is a fanciful, again, form of Gothic. And you can see here that Pugin admits, I have perpetrated many of these enormities in the furniture I designed some years ago for Windsor Castle. At that time, I had not the least idea of the principles that I'm now explaining, which was to turn away from the Gothic of the 18th century towards an architecturally correct format. In addition to that, Pugin is going to argue for the handmade. In the contrast that you have here, you have machine-made regular joints on the left-hand side. They may be perfect, but as far as Pugin is concerned, they're soulless. The contrasting figure shows you handmade, hand-cut stone, roughness, irregularity, and variety. Of course, this will become one of the polemics of the arts and crafts movement, head, hands, and heart. You think about it with your head, you make it with your hands, and it comes from your heart. And the argument was that something made by a machine which has no soul cannot be a true work of art. So Pugin's ideas are going to form the basis of those of John Ruskin and in turn those of William Morris. People want the roughness and irregularity of things made by hand. The machine appeared to be the enemy. So Pugin is caught up in this castle building era, though he's equally famous for his perhaps over elaborate churches like St Giles Cheadle, which was, by the way, paid for by the Earl of Shrewsbury. The Earl of Shrewsbury, of course, is Catholic, and Pugin definitely benefited from having, appealing to Catholic patrons. In addition to that, following the Emancipation Acts of the 1820s, there was a need for new churches, both Catholic and nonconformist. So Pugin, if you like, was definitely able to further his career at just the right time. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of Alton Towers, but this is Alton Castle above the Churnet Valley, 1843 in date. Please don't go to visit, because I'm afraid it is very private. It is still part and parcel of a summer school run by Catholic schools. So here it is overlooking the valley, and it's built on a genuine castle, which was in ruins, but it has now become very fancifully reconstructed. I don't think there's any archaeological proof for the structure of the roofs in particular, which are, as you can see, either covered with lead or here over the chapel, rather beautifully coloured. You can see here the original foundations on which Alton Castle is built and its defensible position looking down over the ravine and the river. So it's a good example of one way in which castles were revived by basically rebuilding existing ones, or in the case of Alton Castle, just really only having the footprint of the ruins. Alton Towers itself started out as a very modest hunting lodge and then grew by leaps and bounds. Many worked on this for good Earl John, as he was referred to, very philanthropic in his outlook. Thomas Allison, William Hollis and Thomas Hopper were all architects who worked on expanding Alton Towers before Pugin was brought in to do yet more work between 1837 and his death in 1852, which was rather conveniently the same year in which the 16th Earl of Shrewsbury died. So here is Alton Towers as it looked at almost its fullest extent. And you can see that it is still has, lots of shades of the 18th century style of Gothic with a K, simply because it is so symmetric and so regularized in terms of its roof line. Bear this in mind when we start to look at Cardiff Castle in a minute. But you can see a lot of the square-headed windows definitely are reminiscent of Hampton Court. It's now only a shell. It exists within the spectacle that is Alton Towers, which you might know is famous for its rides. You can visit, you can take ghost walks, and there are one or two elements that are almost intact, like the chapel that you see here. This was not built by Pugin, but by one of his predecessors. But trying to again improve its Gothic features, he installed this rather wonderful painted roof. I love the way in which the corbels are stylized painted angels, and Pugin very much believed in colour. He was trying to revive or to reconstruct the way that these buildings might have looked in the medieval period, and his favourite colours really were red, blue and gold. The overall effect, I think you'll agree, though, still looks rather more Tudor. Arundel Castle is another good example of a building that grows and is expanded and is made to look more medieval. And this was also for a really important Catholic patron. So like the Earl of Shrewsbury, the Duke of Norfolk is our other really important Catholic peer. These are not families that convert. They have been Catholic since the Reformation. Interestingly, Charles Buckler, who is the architect employed by Henry Fitzaland Howard, is another convert to Roman Catholicism, as was the architect of the chapel at Arundel, which is Charles Aloysius Hanson. Here is Arundel Castle as it looks before it is completely, really, reconfigured between 1875 and 1905. You can see what I mean about the regularity of the windows. Many of them look like the Hampton Court square heads, the castellations, and you can just make out in the background a tower which is completely covered in foliage. But this is what it will look like after Charles Buckler has finished. As you can see, the surrounding wall is reinstated. The motte and bailey is recreated. All that foliage is cleared away. And the state rooms, as you can see, are truly awesome. You can just see on the horizon here, pointed out with my cursor, the beautiful, looks almost like a chapel, but it's actually the parish church created by Hanson, again under the auspices of the Dukes of Norfolk. So perhaps some of the buildings that you think of as genuinely medieval, you're beginning to realise that the Victorians could not but help but improve them. Alnwick Castle would be another good example, the architect of that being Anthony Salvin. More of that anon. So you can imagine that these interiors might be a little bit awe-inspiring to use at a domestic level. So here we are inside Arundel Castle, about to dine. Magnificent fireplace on the right-hand side. Many of these medieval halls would have not had fireplaces of this ilk. They'd have had a central fireplace and a louver in the roof. And the overall effect is really still to make you feel as though you're in a church. Now, I wasn't sure whether Scarisbrick would count as a castle or not, but I thought that tower does give it quite a spectacular roofline. Not only that, it shows you that it's not just aristocrats who are interested in building in the Gothic style. This amazing house in Lancashire was started by Pugin, but then his son took over and in particular extended the tower up to the rather ridiculous height that you see here. Charles Scarisbrick was a wealthy Catholic owner and really had to fight a legal battle to inherit Scarisbrick Hall. Perhaps because of that reason, he really wanted to put over the idea that he had a right to the land and to the title, as he tries to convince us in the interior of the longevity of his family. This is the King's Room, painted in honour of Henry VIII and his wives, as you can see from the panels round the top of the King's Room on the left-hand side. And all of these medieval houses or medieval castles will want to recreate the Great Hall with the minstrel's gallery and the screen's passage, as you can see here on the right-hand side. Scarisbrick has survived, albeit there has been some reduction, but it is now a school. However, the most perhaps fascinating story in terms of conversion is that of John Brighton Stuart, 3rd Marquis of Bute, who was born in 1847 and dies in 1900, as he is, according to his Welsh tenants, perverted to the Catholic faith. And you see him here photographed in the guise of a monk. I've always had the impression that if the Marquis of Bute could have been a monk, or even better, a scholar, he would have been much happier than the job that actually came to him, which was running these vast estates that stretched from Scotland to Pembrokeshire. The ancestral home is actually the island of Bute, but through propitious marriages, the Butes inherit an enormous estate in Pembrokeshire, which of course is centred on Cardiff and Cardiff Castle. This is the chapel at Cardiff Castle, which is very rarely open to the public. It's absolutely tiny. It was not meant even for the servants. It was exclusively for the use of the Marquis of Bute and his wife, who inevitably was also Catholic and from the family of the Dukes of Norfolk. So keeping it all in the family, if I can put it that way. So here he is as a child. He is, I'm afraid, loses his father when he's only 6 months old, and he's often described as the wealthiest baby in Britain. Here he is before he is breeched or put into trousers. You can see immediately behind him the Gothic stylization of Cardiff Castle. Please note how symmetrical it is and how devoid of towers. But the third Marquis of Bute was extremely lucky in meeting the architect of his dreams. He isn't able to start rebuilding Cardiff Castle until after he comes of age, and that's of course 21. And so he inherits title and castle and really starts to transform it from 1868 onwards with, of course, the help of William Burges. After Pugin, I think Burges is the most important architect of the Gothic revival, and I've come to think of him as, in effect, the pre-Raphaelite architect. He shares almost the same birth and death dates as Rossetti, born 1 year before, 1827, and dying 1 year before, in fact, Rossetti in 1882, and they were great friends, hence that wonderful limerick at the top by Rossetti. There's a babyish party named Burges who from infancy scarcely emerges. If you had not been told he's disgracefully old, you would offer a bullseye to Burges. He's looking very sober, isn't he, in his portrait, but in the middle, looking a little bit like Kenny Everett, he's dressed as a jester. The big difference between Pugin and Burges is that Burges has a fabulous sense of humour. He also has no idea about budgets. You might have got that from Pugin as well, because Burges was independently wealthy. His father was an engineer and part of the consortium that had built the Bute docks. This will also give him the means to create his own wonderful house in London, which you'll see a bit later. So the aristocrats had found the perfect architect to rebuild Cardiff Castle. And the first project that they worked on was the Bachelor Tower. Towers over the corner of Cardiff Castle, making quite a statement. You could imagine what the locals thought as this rather Italianate Gothic tower was going up. Burgess's idea of the Gothic is wide-ranging. He collected Japanese prints, was fascinated like Ruskin with the Gothic architecture of Venice. And all of this will get blurred into this vision that he has of Cardiff Castle. So here on the clock tower, we've got 9-foot high figures fully painted. They again are associated with the astrological signs. Those are all the Bute coats of arms. There are many of them, the Stuart family, the Norfolk family, of course, which is who he's going to marry into, will add to this amazing display of lineage. Anyway, we're jumping ahead to when he gets married. Before that, just let me show you the interior of the Bachelor Tower. So this is the lowest room and is known as the winter smoking room. Ironically, it's to celebrate love, which conquers all. The scene on the fireplace, which, by the way, all of this is carved in stone and gilded, is representing scenes from winter. We've got hunting, we've got them sitting around the fire. On the very far right, we even have them skating. The decorations painted on the walls represent the different ceilings, and there are plenty of references to the days of the week and also the months of the year. Times of the day are represented by these elaborately carved baubles. Remember, this is all carved stone. It's not fake in any way. So we have a full sun to represent noon, and the moon in the form of a woman is casting her shadow over the sun to represent dusk. Moving up to the next main level, we have Lord Bute's bedroom. This was to celebrate his mineral wealth. The vast resources that he could draw on came obviously from the mineral wealth of Wales, the black gold, the coal, but this sort of is more wide-ranging and also celebrates technological innovation, which again appears to be very apt for the Victorian era. The fireplace is studded with all sorts of semi-precious stones, again to represent mineral wealth. His bath, however, is a reused Roman sarcophagus. And to make you raise an eyebrow, it is studded with copper animals, aquatic animals like this copper fish here, which evidently could deliver quite a sharp burn if you inadvertently sat on them when the bath had been filled up with scalding hot water. We go up from Lord Bute's bedroom to the so-called summer smoking room, which has got this wonderful image of Apollo and the sun right in the centre. Double height with a minstrel's gallery. The idea of this room is really to celebrate a microcosm, a cosmos, a cosmos. The lower section very much devoted to the 4, or I should say 8, classical wings of antiquity, as there are 2 wings on each of the 4 columns. Again, love plays its part in the decoration of the mantelpiece, and the amazing decorative walls, that's tiles, very apt for a smoking room, as these were hygienic and could easily be cleaned. You'll find a preponderance of lovebirds throughout Cardiff Castle. They were a particular favourite of Burges. So here are my winds. These winds are coming via a Saracen, so they are representing in effect the Holy Land, and the winds coming from the east. And also similarly we've got these 2 figures here who represent India, and I love the fact they're not just heads, they're entire bodies. There is not a surface of Cardiff Castle that is not decorated, but all this decoration is imbued with meanings and is all about storytelling. So I mentioned that that's the Bachelor Tower. He is soon, that's the Lord Bute, about to get married, and now he's going to convert the castle into a family home. Lots of towers will arise, as you can see, particularly the magnificent lead-covered one in the centre, known as a flesh or an arrow. The basic original Gothic building still survives below. It's the towers that are important. And if you go to visit, remember that tourism at Cardiff is vertical. One tower is 120 steps. That's up to the summer smoking room. And the other tower is about 80. So here we have the Marquis of Bute, painted by Hubert von Herkommer in his manorial robes. And on the other side, we have Gwendolen Howard, as in the Earls of Norfolk. So 2 now Catholic family marrying into our story. And by the way, the family are Catholic to this day. So they start to produce children. There are 4 in all. Margaret is the eldest and only daughter and will be a companion for her mother in her early widowhood. John is going to be the heir, and they are all given, as you can see, Welsh names, Ninian and Colum. They were also expected to learn French, and when they were in Wales, they were expected to learn and perhaps even speak Welsh. The important thing is that the Marquis of Bute was very keen on the Welsh aspects as well as the Scottish aspects of his family. Got a wonderful nursery, as you can see again, where tiles play an important role. Over the fireplace was to remind the children that fame isn't everything. So you have the 2 trumpets blowing. And again, the idea is to work hard, to not turn into an ass. Because if you look very carefully, the figure that represents fame has got ass's ears. The tiles at Cardiff Castle are always attributed to Walter Horatio Lonsdale, because Burges had a very devoted team that helped him with all of these projects. Lonsdale did the tiles and most of the mural painting. The architectural projects were aided by William Frame, who will also work on Mount Stuart, and John Chappell will be instrumental in finishing off Castel Foch. In other words, Burges couldn't have achieved this without his team, and also the creation of special workshops at Cardiff Docks to actually facilitate the amounts of joinery, carving, all of the splendid decoration that you see required, in fact, a revival of the crafts. So there was something very positive that came out of the building of Cardiff Castle. Here we're looking at the tiles running along the bottom, Fatima and Bluebeard. We've then got Red Riding Hood, we've got Reynard the Fox, and right in the corner Robin Hood and Little John and Friar Tuck. It's great fun, and again the idea of tiles means of course that they are easy to clean and hygienic in a nursery. I do love the way they have a special lantern which is Mary Mary quite contrary, how does your garden grow? So everything, even in the nursery, is there in terms of the decoration for its significance. Going into the banqueting room, you can see here what I mean about using the building as a means of telling the history, in fact, of Cardiff. Robert Consul is credited with being the architect of the keep in the centre of the castle, and the walls here are decorated with one of the great sort of sagas in British history. We can see a monk in a scriptorum that's actually writing up the story of what is known as the Great Anarchy. Robert Consul was the half-brother of the Empress Matilda and her chief military supporter during the civil war known as the Anarchy. Matilda vied with Stephen of Blois, who will of course eventually win, for the throne of England. But in this episode depicted here, in the mantelpiece, Robert has imprisoned Stephen in Bristol. You can see, in fact, Stephen imprisoned right at the bottom of the fireplace. He's got a grill over his window opening. Robert Consul is setting off to go into battle. Rather charmingly, his wife is waving him on his way. You can see from the style of the painted decoration that they're very clear and easy to read. They have an almost cartoon-like quality. Burges didn't employ any pre-Raphaelites, and this is for this project, and this is primarily because it was so much his vision, and also he wanted the mural decoration to look authentically medieval. So it's a very simplistic, rather sort of linear, looks almost like it could be book illustrations. Humour is never very far away, however. So here we are looking at the staircase that would take you down from the banqueting hall to the library. As you can see at the top, there is a crocodile, and he's chasing a baby who is luckily escaping by sliding down the banister. And it's these humorous elements that make Burges's buildings so much fun. I mentioned that Burges was very eclectic in his interests. So on the one hand, he collected Japanese prints, and like many, he was fascinated by Islamic art and architecture. So inevitably, we have an Arab room. These are not as uncommon as you might imagine in the Victorian era. The most famous in London is, of course, Lord Leighton's Arab room. And these two creations are almost the same date. The Arab room at Cardiff Castle dates to 1881. And that was about the time that Lord Leighton was extending his studio house in Holland Park. However, the ceiling at Cardiff Castle is much more ambitious, much closer, in fact, to Islamic prototypes. It's made out of wood and elaborately gilded. The fireplace has become something of a memento mori. It's on the right-hand side. It's actually inscribed with the date that William Burges died. And clearly this was a huge loss to the Marquis of Bute in terms of furthering his dream of Cardiff Castle and Castell Coch, as you'll see in a minute. So this is me just being artistically driven. It's just a wonderful view looking up at the jelly mold type ceiling. A beautiful, evocative image. And this is an equally beautiful ceiling, but now we've got glass inserted, and we are in Lord Bute's bedroom. So we've gone up another tower. This must have been a very busy room in which to sleep, and also perhaps one that was quite a challenge, as it has the name of Jesus, as you can see, a mirror image, sort of front and back, inscribed on the ceiling. And in fact, the theme of this room, and all the rooms are themed, are the 7 churches of the Revelation of St. John. The beautiful windows each hold a church. They're by Lavers, Barrard and Westlake. I haven't really spoken about the stained glass, but like so many aspects of Cardiff Castle, they are top quality, beautifully designed and crafted windows, again, all under the watchful eye of Burges. The designers for these windows are Nathaniel Hubert and John Wesley. So St. John is looking down at you from the fireplace. Must have been quite a challenge to sleep in this room, and the Lord Bute's bed does look a bit of a challenge in its own right. It doesn't look that large, to be quite honest, and is cast iron. I want to point out that the wardrobe in the background, because although you can't quite see, the decoration on the front of it is moths, to remind you to put in your moth repellent. And I'm pleased to say that his bathing has improved. He's got a much more technologically advanced bath, as you can see on the right-hand side. Carrying up the same tower, I think you come to my favourite room. I'm never quite sure which is my favourite room at Cardiff Castle, but here is the rooftop garden. It was at one time open to the weather, but now it's covered over for obvious reasons. The troughs would originally have been filled full of all sorts of wonderful greenery. It would have felt more like a conservatory. The lower tiles with red are again animals, and then the main tile panels are scenes from the Old Testament. But my favourite feature is, of course, the fountain in the centre, which is decorated with beavers. Each beaver is holding a fish, which was originally a spout, and I would dearly love to see the fountain working. And perhaps frustratingly, as it's disappeared, at the very top there was an even larger beaver. I do wish they would either find it or reinstate it. Those beavers can be found again in the library. And I should mention that the Marquis of Bute, he was obsessed with his animals. So remembering that he lost his father at a very young age, he lost his mother when he was in his early teens. He was a quiet, very shy and reserved young man, and he really put his emotional wealth into his animals. He had many pets, a hedgehog, a guinea pig, and he loved beavers so much that he actually attempted to reintroduce them to the River Taff, with rather disastrous consequences. So here you see one in the library, again gnawing on fish. The library is designed to echo the chained libraries of the medieval world, like the one at the Bodleian, and you can see here that they are again lavishly decorated. You'll find all sorts of animals. I particularly like the monkeys who have got hold of the books. Is this a little quip about Darwin? Some of the monkeys do indeed appear to have side whiskers, and the monkey on the right-hand side is holding an apple, which I'm assuming is a reference to the Tree of Knowledge. That theme of monkeys can be traced to Castel Hoch, and we're looking here at the amazing drawing room ceiling, which has a large sunburst in the centre, and down the ribs lots of stylized butterflies. The ceiling itself is covered with birds, and I suppose really because the theme of this room is also time in terms of its ornamentation. You'll see exactly why in a minute, but there's also sort of a theme of paradise in this wonderful ceiling, looking up to that great big golden sun in the centre. Again, none of this is cheating. This is all carved stone, which is then painted and gilded. When Burges began to work on Castel Hoch, it was just a ruin. A survey is taken of the site in 1872, and then that is when work seriously starts on recreating it. And here it is from the outside. So literally he just had the foundations. He had no idea how the roofs might have looked. We know that he drew on medieval manuscripts for those famous conical roofs, but also in 1873, just as he was conceiving Castelfort, he went to visit Pierrefonds. Pierrefonds is one of the most romantic castles in France. It's just to the northeast of Paris. It was purchased as a ruin by Napoleon I in 1810, but it wasn't until 1857 that Napoleon III begins to rebuild it, and his architect is Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. You can think of Viollet-le-Duc as the French equivalent of Pugin. Although his buildings might be criticised, his voluminous encyclopedia of medieval architecture and furniture was used by many other architects, including Pugin. You can see here the romantic roofline of Pierrefonds, and you'll find a similar romantic roofline recreated by Viollet-le-Duc at Carcassonne, and he also rebuilt Notre Dame de Paris. What I want you to notice here are the amazing towers. This is a portrait of Viollet-le-Duc, who marks the entrance to the chapel. So here are those towers, because this may be very well where Burges got the idea of the conical roofs, as there was no documentary evidence at all for the roofs of Castelfort. And you could again argue that they are not very defensible, but I think more than anything else, Burges wanted, like Viollet-le-Duc, a very romantic roofline. And there's an equal splash of humour at Pierrefonds. So this is one of the downpipes encased in this giant scaly lizard. And I could show you many more wonderful gargoyles that are scattered over Pierrefonds. Inside, not all of the rooms were completed by the time Napoleon lost his empire. Of course, he was ejected during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. But this part of the castle was actually completed. It's a wonderful, evocative recreation of a medieval great hall. It's known as the Room of the 9 Worthy Women. There seem to have been a lot of worthy women in the Victorian era, again drawing on medieval precursors. We've got Chaucer's Good Women, and we've got Tennyson's Good Women. There seems that you can have 9, 10 or 12, depending on which source you're using. So we're looking here into the Great Hall. As you come in, you'll see there is a magnificent screen with a gallery above it. But I just love, again, the homage that is paid here to, again, heraldry. And originally the room was filled full of armour, as I will show you. There we are. Here it is, the room filled with armour. And again, you get this sort of like equal appropriation of the Gothic to now represent French heritage as opposed to English. Looking down to the magnificent fireplace, you can see some obvious synergies between Cardiff Castle and Castelfort. So here, a close-up of those 9 good women. All their names are written along the bottom, and you might well question just how good some of them are. Usually the 9 good women includes Guinevere, and you could argue that her affair with Lancelot did not make her a particularly good woman, but it certainly makes for a splendid fireplace at the ends of the Great Hall. The room that particularly influenced Burges, however, was the Empress's own room, which was a double height, beautifully decorated interior, as you can see here. And this convinces Burges, when he comes back from his holiday in France in 1873, to reconfigure the drawing room at Castelfort. Originally, there were going to be 4 rooms that filled this tower. Now there are going to be only 2. This magnificent double height drawing room and Lady Bute's bedroom immediately above. The theme of time is played out here in the fireplace, which depicts a Clotho, Lachiasis, and Atropos, as in atrophy. We have your years literally measured out in the form of a thread. Underneath we have a baby, mature man, and an elderly man. You're now looking up at that wonderful minstrel's gallery again, and that fantastic ceiling with all of its birds. The walls are decorated with paintings after Aesop's fable. The lower section reminds me always of the Green Dining Room by William Morris, which had been completed by the firm between 1865 and 67. The tiles are on the theme of the signs of the zodiac. And here's my favourite section of the wall decoration. The frog in the centre is to represent the idea of having a frog in your throat. And the monkey again appears to have grown whiskers. Again, is this some sort of reference to Darwin, who was renowned for his long whiskers? And one of the obvious elements from Aesop's fables, well, you can just see on the edge the hare and the tortoise, but I'm showing you the wily fox, the crane, in fact it's a stork, and I want to like the Japanese vase. Upstairs, Lady Bute's bedroom is an equally flight of fancy. I'm never quite sure if I'd want to sleep in that bed with its crystal balls. She did, however, have all mod cons. Here is her vanity unit. We've got two turrets to either side, and there was cold water in one and hot water on the other. And the idea was that they would blend together, and they could be poured into your bowl underneath, which rather conveniently has a little fish floating on the surface. And looking up at the ceiling, well, we're back to those amazing mirrors, but the painted decoration is rows of vineyard grapes, because the Lord Bute reinstated the vineyard at Castel Coch, then red squirrels, and then pomegranates for fecundity and fertility. But you can see how he is very good at creating the most wonderful ceilings, though I think Castel Coch will be given a run for its money at Mount Stuart. I'm looking here at the central ceiling of the wonderful marble hall. Those are crystals creating the constellations against a dark blue sky. You can also see the constellations, the star signs are painted in. This castle is not built by William Burges, but William Frame, who had worked with Burges, started work on Mount Stuart alongside the architect who is my namesake, Anderson. At the end there with the lead flesh is the chapel. That's the chapel for the estate. Everybody used that. There's a private chapel as well. And here we are in the marble hall, and I always want to sing the famous song from the Bohemian Girl, I dreamt that I dwelt in marble halls. And these are very expensive marbles indeed, all imported from Italy. No expense was spared. I understand over 20,000 was spent on the marble columns alone. As we rise up onto the second floor by this magnificent staircase, you'll be taken up to a vantage point for those stained glass windows. You can see that they are also the signs of the zodiac. We're looking at Taurus here, and you can pick out the constellations, the crystals in the ceiling are replicated in the windows. And here are two more, one for Pisces, so all the fish, and the other, the ram, for Aries. Anyway, here we are in the chapel, and looking up at this amazing ceiling. This is the chapel used by everybody within the family and for the servants as well, I imagine. And there was a private chapel as well. Now, Mount Stuart was largely unfinished when the Marquis of Bute died. It was completed by his wife, Gwendolen, as far as she could, money permitting, but the family have carried on contributing to its beauty, and most recently, the recently deceased, I'm afraid, Marquis of Bute, the famous racing driver, wanted to improve the private chapel by putting in a mirrored floor to therefore get the wonderful reflection of the ceiling above. That was a bit of a problem in Scotland, because obviously on the grand opening, all the men turned up in their kilts. So there might have been a few blushes on that night. However, not all Gothic castles or Gothic houses have been as lucky in terms of their survival as Castell Coch and Cardiff Castle, or for that matter, Mount Stuart. Here's the jelly mould ceiling, not in fact by Burges because he was kicked off the project, but by Crayson Sons. And we're looking at a ceiling in Knight's Haze. Knight's Haze is a good example of how you really needed to have a limitless budget to build these houses. The Heathcote Amories took fright when they saw the cost of Burges's interior for their new home near Tiverton, and Burges was replaced by Crayson Sons, equally well known for their interior decor of the Palace of Westminster, and also they worked on Tidsfield, another magnificent Gothic house just outside Bristol. Originally, this might have looked more castle-like if Burges had had his way, as he planned a very large tower that was never built. My reason for including this is to show you how when the Gothic goes out of fashion, it is often masked. And the National Trust has been working very hard over the last 20 or so years to reinstate many of the Gothic features. The heraldry here over the screen's passage, and we're in the Great Hall with its wonderful Viollet-le-Duc style fireplace. Or here in the library, the bookcases are all by Crayson Sons. The ceiling, a sort of watered down version of what Burges might have approved of, but all of this was blocked in by later owners of Knight's Haze. It's only recently been uncovered. So that's the library. This is the drawing room at the end. Again, the ceiling here was blocked in. The good news is that they blocked it in rather than destroying it. The fireplace at the end of the room, however, was the one conceived by Burges, was very like the ones we've been looking at Cardiff Castle. But the one you're seeing here is from Worcester College, Oxford, another project that Burges worked on. And this was deemed surplus to requirement, or perhaps no longer in keeping with the way that Worcester College wishes to present itself. So you'll now find that it's moved from Worcester College, Oxford, to Knight's Haze. Burges's furniture and interiors do take some beating in terms of flights of fancy. So upstairs at Knight's Haze, you'll find this reconstruction of Burges's chambers in London at Buckingham Street. The bed is themed to the Judgment of Paris. But if you really want to see the best of Burges's furniture, the best place to visit is the Higgins Art Gallery in Bedford. On the left-hand side, we've got the so-called Narcissus washstand. My panel at the top is actually representing Echo, who is part of the story. And on the right-hand side is Burges's wardrobe, very amusingly covered, as you can see, with figures holding up pairs of socks. And down the bottom, we have a cutthroat, we have shaving cream and a comb. The back of his bed is decorated with the Sleeping Beauty. The foot is decorated with his dogs, two what appear to be terriers, one with the wonderful name of Bogey. And the great bookcase, as it's called, which is now in the Ashmolean in Oxford, and which will feature in the forthcoming exhibition at the Ashmolean, which opens at the end of September, on the theme of colour in the Victorian era. Well, the top row of birds is the death of Cock Robin, and the element below with the cow and the dog is taken from Aesop's fables. So he is the master, if I can put it, of bringing colour into Victorian architecture. Could we really live in such incredibly busy and colourful interiors? Here is an original watercolour of Burges's living room of his London townhouse, known as a Tower House. Well, the answer to that is that somebody does indeed live in this remarkable interior, and it is Jimmy Page. He bought Tower House at least 30 years ago, and his rival was David Bowie, or David Bowie even. I imagine that there's an obvious appeal to rock and rollers and Gothic architecture. you might spot the settle on the right-hand side, and that's courtesy of Morris & Co. And here it is, the Tower House from the exterior on Melbury Road. And Burges was able to build this magnificent London home, his own residence, because if you remember, he had the means to do so, thanks to his father. I want to remind you, as we come to the end, that there are plenty of other amazing castles built across Europe. That the Gothic meant as much to the Germans as it did to the French in terms of a national Christian style. The way that you could appropriate English Gothic, French Gothic, Venetian Gothic, you could blend East and West, gave it a rather cosmopolitan feel. For anybody who's been to visit Neuschwanstein, built for Mad Ludwig, as he's sometimes called, you know that the interior is more Byzantine than anything else. And it seems that the allure of castles has continued in the 20th century. So here the wonderful turreted fantasy castle at Disney. Florida and California both have their Sleeping Beauty castles. But I'm going to leave you with this wonderful castle that is now a hotel. Peckforton Castle in Cheshire, built for the Tolmarsh family. Again, new money, by Anthony Salvin. It was described, as you can see, by the Illustrated London News. Seems to exhibit the peculiar beauties of Carnarvon Castle without its inconveniences. I do love that idea. And Scott recorded it as the largest and most carefully and learned executed Gothic mansion of the present, and that it was the very height of masquerading. Well, you can masquerade there if you want to. You don't have to have it as a wedding. It has now been converted into a hotel. So you can enjoy, like the Victorians, the fantasy of living in the age of chivalry.